Hello and welcome to the DIBELS AD webinar for DIBELS AD for mCLASS DIBELS Next. Today we're going to discuss some of the administration protocols of DIBELS AD as well as go into more detail about the product. As for the agenda, my name is Susan Laspada. I'm the Associate Product Owner for DIBELS AD at Amplify. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about how DIBELS AD differs from DIBELS Next, some guidelines and administration rules, the mCLASS app and mCLASS Home for DIBELS AD, and also the reporting analysis suite. After my portion of the presentation is complete, Dr. Roland Good and Dr. Kelly Powell-Smith from DMG, the authors of DIBELS AD, will speak to you in a little bit more detail about the product, including an overview of DIBELS AD, pathways of progress, and the goal-setting utility. In the last 10 minutes of the presentation, we'll reserve for live question and answer. So just so you know, we are taking the questions via the chat box in the left corner of your screen. So during the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box and we'll try to respond in the last 10 minutes. If we cannot get to your questions, we'll respond offline. So a few of the questions that we get about DIBELS AD is how it differs from DIBELS Next. A lot of districts want to know, why can't I use DIBELS Next for administration for accountability purposes if it's already implemented? And the main idea behind this is that DIBELS Next was never intended or developed to be used for decisions such as evaluating teacher accountability. It was created solely to help identify students who need instructional support. As you know, DIBELS Next forms are reused year by year. They're not kept secure. Anyone who is trained in the proper protocol for the assessment can administrate it, and it's also used for progress monitoring. DIBELS AD was built for the sole purpose of evaluating individual teachers for accountability. It's also used for instructional purposes, but because the forms switch each year EOI and they're kept secure, it makes it a more fair, secure, and research-supported assessment for accountability. So as you can see, DIBELS AD, based on the same exact research as DIBELS Next, it's been approved for evaluating teachers for accountability. The forms are kept secure, and the original classroom teacher cannot be the assessor at EOI. Some guidelines and administration practices for DIBELS AD. So the data from DIBELS AD forms can be used for both informing instruction and for higher stake decisions such as teacher accountability. To use DIBELS AD, there is a requirement that you must have DIBELS AD benchmark assessments completed for BOI. This is because the results from DIBELS AD compares your growth from BOI composite score to EOI composite score. You'll use your existing DIBELS Next forms for BOI, MOI, and progress monitoring. So if you do choose to progress monitor students after your EOI assessments, you'll use the progress monitoring forms within the DNext kit. Also, you must wait until your EOI window opens to administer DIBELS AD. If your EOI window hasn't begun, the application won't let you begin the assessment. And then lastly, if there is a need to invalidate the DIBELS AD assessment and restart it, you can use the DNext progress monitoring materials as alternate EOI forms. However, we want to stress that this should be on very rare occasions, so you should only be invalidating your DIBELS AD assessment if something happened that makes the form not valid anymore. For instance, it was interrupted by a fire alarm or there was an announcement over the PA system. When you do decide to use the alternate EOI forms, you should select the PM form at the end of the kit. So you'll have 20 PM forms, and we suggest that you start at the 20th and work your way backwards so that there's less risk that the student has already been exposed to that form. Also, for EOI, you'll be receiving new DIBELS AD forms, and you'll be receiving them shortly. Right now, we're still in the process of printing the forms and shipping them to your schools, but you will have them before the EOI window opens. Once you receive them, you should make sure that you keep them secure, and that you distribute them to the appropriate teachers once the EOI benchmark assessments begin. If you do have other applications, such as Reading 3D, Now What tools, RTI, math, etc., you'll have the exact capabilities that you currently have for these assessments. You'll still be able to assess TRC the way you do now. You'll still be able to use all the Now What tools on your EOI assessments. Nothing will change from what you currently have. Also, a change that we're implementing this year is that you will be able to access a Download Your Data DIBELS AD report that will identify the classroom's overall reading progress. This report will be accessible via the Reporting and Analysis Suite on mCLASS Home, and I'll discuss that in a little more detail in another slide. Some of the DIBELS AD scores will be equated to align with DIBELS Next. We're taking as many precautions as we can to ensure that DIBELS AD and DIBELS Next forms are aligned as closely as possible. So for DAYS, including DAYS, Fluency, Accuracy, and Retail, as well as DORF, Fluency, Accuracy, and Retail, as well as DAYS and Composite score, some scores may be equated so that the forms are aligned to DNext. One other thing to keep in mind is that the actual administration of DIBELS AD will be exactly the same as the administration for DIBELS Next. You'll use the application the exact way. There will be very few UI changes to the product, and the scores will show up exactly as expected after you sync on mCLASS Home. As stated in the last slide, we will be doing a few equating adjustments depending on the outcome of an equating study that we're doing. As you can see, there will be some UI changes. So if you look on this one right here, you can see that this is your mCLASS app, and this is where you would see your running girl. And you can tell that this score has been equated. And we do show the original score. So for this score, for DORF, you can see Fluency was 245 raw score. But after we apply the equated score, you have 248. And in this particular example, Accuracy and Retail weren't affected, but sometimes Accuracy and Retail will also be equated. We show the identical thing on mCLASS Home probe detail pages, where we show the raw and the equated scores so that you know that that score has changed slightly. You will use the equated score for both your instructional and your accountability decisions. And lastly, I want to touch on the Reporting and Analysis Suite. So I've attached a sample of the Classroom Reading Progress Report that you'll receive. And for 2013-2014 school year, the report will be a CSV file, similar to the Download Your Data file that you currently use on mCLASS Home. And this can be opened in any spreadsheet application, such as Excel. And what we're doing here is we're getting an average of the students who are making typical or above typical progress, and then getting an overall classroom progress description here. So in this particular example, the grade K class, you can see there was 25 students, and you can see that 20 of those students are making typical or above typical progress. And based on that, we're saying that that class, as an overall average, is above classroom, has above average classroom reading progress. And then that data is actually based on your DAD data that will assign students to one of 5 pathways. So what we're doing is we're comparing BOI to EOI composite scores and then determining the pathway for each student. Dr. Roland Good will be explaining pathways of progress in more detail. That'll give you a better idea of how we determine this data and how do we determine which pathway each student falls into. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Rowan Good, and he's going to explain DIBELS AD in a little bit more detail, touch on the pathways of progress data, and also talk about the goal setting utility.
Hello and welcome. This is Roland Good, coming to you live from Eugene, Oregon, where the weather is gray and drizzly and a very large improvement from ice and snow of last week. With me today is my colleague, Dr. Kelly Powell-Smith. She and I have been working together on this DIBELS AD endeavor, and it's just been a very important collaboration for me. So she is going to sort of kick us off with this discussion, and then I will chime in.
Okay, thank you, Roland. I just want to share just for a moment about our agenda for our portion of the webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about how to frame the evaluation and some key considerations as we think about accountability and teacher evaluation. And then we're going to go through some specific things related to DIBELS AD, and they're listed there on the agenda for you. We'll talk about the reason behind why we started down this path. We'll talk about some features and procedures. We'll talk about the pathways of progress in greater detail, as Susan mentioned. We'll talk about the reports that go along with the pathways and how those translate to the classroom progress percentiles and the DIBELS AD reports. And then we'll finish up by talking about some caveats and considerations we'd like folks to keep in mind as they move forward with the DIBELS AD process. And then, of course, we have time for questions at the end. So some things to be thinking about as a framework for this DIBELS AD process is that we want the teacher evaluation process to keep in mind that the idea is to support effective instruction and enhance student growth and outcomes, and that if to the degree that we do that, that adds value to educational systems. And so just kind of keeping that in mind as we think about sort of some of the nuts and bolts to try to have in the back of your head, what's our goal with doing all of this? And we want this information to be useful to folks as they think about developing district and school level improvement plans, that this information would help inform that process. And in addition, also help to inform professional development and other kinds of decisions related to personnel in schools and school administration. And so those are sort of some big ideas to keep in mind as we talk about teacher evaluation. Some key considerations that we'd like folks to think about is, regardless of the system used for evaluation, no system can completely isolate a teacher's impact on a student's test scores. And DIBELS AD provides one piece of information that we consider really valuable with respect to students' growth in literacy skills. But any student achievement test really only shows us a portion of what a teacher imparts to his or her students. And so it's an important piece of information, but DIBELS AD is one piece of information, and we would like folks to consider and keep in mind other important and valuable pieces of information as part of their system for determining educator effectiveness. And then obviously I've highlighted the word system here several times. That's an important thought as well, is that this is a system of evaluation, and we'd like that system to take into account sort of the full range of information that's available, both about what teachers are doing as well as the context in which teachers teach. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and how we try to build in some reminders about that into the reporting process later on. So the idea is to this process should be used to help improve practice, and so that's one of our goals. Some additional things to think about. We all know that many folks are responsible for student learning in schools, and so in addition to the teacher, the classroom teacher, there might be an interventionist involved, an instructional support specialist, and we just don't want that to sort of get lost in all of this. But we want administrators, as they think about their DIBELS AD data, to also be thinking about what other things might have impacted that classroom reading progress descriptor. Are there things in the system that are built in as resources for professional development and materials resources that help support teachers, or do we need to think about more of those things being built in to help support teachers? So these kinds of decisions we would like to be a part of the DIBELS AD process at large. And class size and makeup are also something to consider, and student opportunity to learn. Students who are absent a lot when there's a lot of mobility within a class, that has an impact on the outcomes that people are getting on those DIBELS AD reports, and we want folks to keep those things in mind. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roland, and he's going to talk a little more specifically about DIBELS AD.
And as you can tell from Kelly's discussion, we really have been very concerned about how these reports would be used and interpreted. We have really come to the development and release of DIBELS for accountability decisions with really considerable thought and discussion in the process. And we really have perceived a fundamental tension. And on the one hand, DIBELS Next is a remarkably reliable and valid system of assessment. When it comes to measuring progress, I'm not sure there's anything that is better than DIBELS Next for measuring progress. But we really did not develop DIBELS Next for accountability decisions. And in this discussion, I'm making a very careful distinction between DIBELS Next and DIBELS AD. DIBELS Next is not designed for accountability. DIBELS AD is something that we have designed for accountability. They're intended to go hand in hand. So we think it would not be appropriate for schools to use only DIBELS Next for accountability. It's not a secure form. The reporting is not designed for that. It would not be appropriate. But a school using DIBELS Next with DIBELS AD, we do think that that would be valuable as a part of a teacher evaluation process. When we engaged in this endeavor in developing DIBELS AD, our goal was really to provide something that would be fair and accurate for teachers and that would empower educators to improve instruction and to make changes in outcomes. We see it as part of a system of assessment that would provide valuable information about classroom progress in the reading area, and there are going to be other areas of instruction and achievement that will be important to consider as well. We hope that DIBELS AD will become the beginning of a professional conversation about where we are, where we want to be, and what we can do to get to there. We see both DIBELS Next and DIBELS AD as helping us to make decisions within an outcomes-driven model. And here I've highlighted the last step of this model, which is reviewing outcomes. And the intent is to have a discussion about how we're doing, how we would like to do, what things we might target in order to do better or to improve our outcomes. This step of reviewing outcomes seems to us to be reasonable both for DIBELS Next, where we're evaluating how we did, and also for DIBELS AD, where we are engaged in accountability decisions. And I want to highlight that difference and how that same step of reviewing outcomes would be thought of across DIBELS Next and DIBELS AD. So on the right is DIBELS Next. And we think that as a part of the regular use of DIBELS Next, we should be using our classroom progress to reflect on how well we're doing and where we would want to get to. How am I doing? How can I improve outcomes? This is going to have to do with my choices of professional development, my selection of coaching. This is a part of what all professional educators should be doing. On the left is really moving this more to high-stakes decisions for accountability. And you'll notice there are some parallels, but but it becomes sort of at a level where we're going to be reviewed by others. A superior or an administrator may be asking, so how are you doing in your class? This may potentially be a part of decisions like salary, merit, promotion, retention. The stakes are much higher. So we need to be very careful about the materials that we use and how that's going to work. So we really wanted to develop DIBELS AD in a way that would both inform our reviewing outcomes, our evaluating outcomes decisions, and also be appropriate for accountability decisions. We are very concerned that this process be fair, be accurate, and be empowering. And by fair, fair to us really targets a couple of issues that we wanted to pay particular attention to. Part of being fair is I want to make sure that the DIBELS assessment materials are used in the appropriate way. Kelly and I both have heard stories that have really concerned us where teachers have practiced the DIBELS Next materials so that their students look good whether or not they're actually able to read proficiently. That would be inappropriate for accountability decisions. It's inappropriate for any use. We can't use that to make good decisions about students or about our own professional growth. But for accountability, it would really lead to wrong conclusions. And a teacher who is using DIBELS as intended would be rightfully concerned about whether or not they're being compared to somebody else who is practicing the measures. So critical to providing a fair assessment is using materials that are secure, that are not available for practice. The students should be engaging these materials cold. It should be the first time that they are reading the passage. We're looking at students' proficiency in reading. A second aspect of being fair is we really were very concerned that teachers not have an unfair disadvantage if they're working with students with very low skills, and also that teachers not have an unfair advantage if they're working with teachers with very high skills. We wanted to use an analysis and reporting approach that would be fair for teachers with a group of high-skilled readers or a group of low-skilled readers. They should have equal opportunity to have above-average classroom reading progress. So we really spent a great deal of time in the way we wanted to approach that. This cannot be something like, well, I'm going to look at the percent of children who are at benchmark at the end of the year. That's not fair. A lot of classrooms start with kids with very high skills who are at or above benchmark at the beginning of the year. If we're working with students with low skills, we need a more fair basis for that evaluation. With pathways of progress and the classroom reading progress analysis, we are able to provide that fair comparison for classrooms with very high skills and very low skills. The last part about being fair is we really wanted to be public to teachers. Here's where as a teacher, I want to be able to say, here's where I am at the beginning of the year. This is where I need to get my students to at the end of the year to achieve a rating of average or above average classroom reading progress. I don't want this to be something that just happens at the end of the year. I want to be able to monitor my progress so I know where my students' skills are going to be at the end of that year. We also wanted this system that would be accurate. And I want to look at reading proficiency as reading for meaning at an adequate rate with a high degree of accuracy. In our opinion, all three of these characteristics of reading are critical to making a statement about reading proficiency. I don't want to be evaluating reading progress based on only one of those three. I want to integrate all three of those. Second, I really want to use a way of looking at reading progress that is sensitive to what teachers do as instructors in their classroom. To us, this is one of the very special aspects of DIBELS. If the classroom teacher is teaching these skills, you see the effect on the skills as measured by DIBELS, and we really wanted to support that. We have done a great deal of research looking at DIBELS AD and how that compares to DIBELS Next. We find that from form to form, there are small differences that for progress monitoring and low-stakes decisions would not be particularly important, but for high-stakes decisions may become important. So we have actually spent this year carefully equating the AD assessments to the DIBELS Next end-of-year assessments. So they are very, very equivalent and precise. Finally, we wanted a system that would empower educators. Because AD is exactly equivalent to DIBELS Next, and because we are using DIBELS Next at beginning of year and middle of year, and we are using DIBELS Next for progress monitoring, I can track where my students are and are we on track for making adequate progress at the end of the year. I can get that information early, I can monitor progress, I can check up on how we are doing. For each individual student in my class, I can use the pathways of progress analysis to establish a goal that is meaningful, ambitious, and attainable. And if my students achieve that goal, my classroom reading progress will be average or even better, above average classroom reading progress. And we're going to show you a little bit about how to do that. Critical to these issues is that the DIBELS AD form is a secure form. It is not available for download. It is not available at the beginning of the year. It is available to you just in time for the end of the year assessment. Amplify and Sopris will be making those forms available to you just in time for the end of the year assessment. It is also important that in your school, as you set up the end-of-year testing with DIBELS AD, that the teacher should not be testing their own students. It would be okay for a teacher to test a different classroom, not their students, or for another teacher to be testing my classroom of students, or it could be done by another specialist or other educator in the school, or by a principal or administrator, but the classroom teacher should not be testing their own students. It just feels to us that it creates a conflict of interest that we would prefer to avoid for the DIBELS AD assessment. Other nice features with DIBELS AD, we're not actually adding any additional assessment. It replaces the regular end-of-year assessment. It provides all of the information of DIBELS Next end of year. We can use it in the same way. Also critical to this is the pathways of progress analysis. Boy, we are so excited about pathways of progress, and you will be hearing more about pathways of progress. More capacity within pathways of progress will be available over the next year. It is a critical foundation that enables us to create the DIBELS AD reports. So our procedures, it's really important that all of the DIBELS AD assessments are conducted with fidelity. It should be given according to the standardized directions. It should be given using the careful DIBELS timing. Materials should be kept secure and they should not be disseminated. They should be used just in time. We recommend that for your school, all of the DIBELS AD assessments occur within a 2 to 3 week window, so everybody is compared on a very equivalent basis. Should not be tested by their own teacher. As an administrator, it's really important to be sensitive to fidelity and accuracy of the testing. If you get a sense that people are not doing it in the standardized way or doing something unusual, it's really important to stress fidelity and accuracy. Data is entered automatically into mCLASS, and when reports are available, the role of administrators in providing a context, in helping teachers understand and frame that report, and helping and supporting teachers to use that information to set professional goals for next year, I think is really just absolutely critical, and we will talk about that a bit further. All of our reports are going to be based upon the pathways of progress. Pathways of progress enable us to set goals, enable us to evaluate progress, and enable us to summarize at a classroom what is the progress that is being made by the students. These pathways of progress are established based upon the beginning of year DIBELS Next composite score. The pathways are customized to each individual student, and for each student, we're able to describe what would be typical progress over the course of a year, what would be above typical, well above typical, as well as what would be below typical or well below typical. Then we can look at percentage of students that are within those pathways. As we establish goals and as we evaluate progress, I'm really looking for goals that are meaningful, that get us closer to the benchmark goals, that are ambitious. I want us to be striving to improve outcomes for students, but I also want goals that are attainable. So as we describe these pathways of progress, I'm going to use a color scheme and a star scheme and a number scheme to describe the pathway. 1 star or pathway number 1 would be well below typical progress. That's when an individual student's progress is below the 20th percentile compared to other students with the same level of initial skills at the beginning of the year. 2 stars would be below typical. 3 stars would represent typical progress between the 40th and 50th percentile of progress compared to other students who started with the same initial skills. 4 stars will be above typical. 5 stars will be well above typical progress. We're able to use those pathways for individual students to set goals and to evaluate their progress. So for example, this shows Tabitha, who was at 65 words correct on the DIBELS oral reading fluency at the beginning of 3rd grade. And I can describe for Tabitha what those different pathways of progress would be. These pathways of progress are based upon Tabitha's beginning of the year composite score. We are able to set the pathway for each component of DIBELS, and we are able to evaluate progress for the end of the year composite. In this discussion, we are really focused on the DIBELS composite score as our best overall statement of where students are in terms of their reading proficiency. We're attracted to the composite because it represents reading for meaning at an adequate rate with a high degree of accuracy. This resonates to us, and resonates to us in the context of the Common Core reading standards as well. And this is taken directly from the Common Core reading standards. Standard number 4 within Fluency in the foundational skills area. And the standard calls for reading with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension, and to use context to confirm understanding. To us, that really corresponds to our DIBELS composite score, which describes reading at an appropriate rate, reading orally with understanding, reading silently for meaning and context, and reading with a high degree of accuracy. All of those aspects go into the composite score. So at the end of the year, this is a classroom progress report for a 4th grade classroom. And what we're doing here is showing the end of the year skills. And as I look at that, I can look at Ashley, and Ashley was at or above benchmark at the beginning of the year. At the end of the year, she is still at or above benchmark. Here I can see her beginning of year composite and her end of the year composite. Her progress over 4th grade was 4 stars. That's going to be above typical progress. Here is Brandon, who was also above benchmark at beginning of the year, still is above benchmark, did not make as much progress. This would be average, typical progress for Brandon. Here is Colette, who is making well above typical progress. Here is Dylan, who is making typical progress. Here is Aaron, who was below benchmark at beginning of the year, well below benchmark at the end of the year. This would represent well below typical progress. But it's not about where they start that determines their progress. For example, here is Fergus. At the beginning of the year was well below benchmark, has made above typical progress. At the end of the year, Fergus is still well below benchmark, but boy, has Fergus improved in his reading skills from beginning to end of year. A similar pattern for Gina. Hans making well below typical progress. So it's not just red to red. We have to look at where they occur within that range and be able to make an evaluation of their progress. So we are able to summarize this for a classroom. And the DIBELS AD reports are summarizing the individual progress at a classroom level. And I'm going to pass this over to Kelly to describe the AD reports.
And as I do that, I want to make a note, because it's related to the AD reports, with respect to highly skilled readers and pathways of progress. So as we did a large-scale pilot study last year with at least 90 schools, and it was in the many states. How many states did I say, Roland? Something like 11.
11 states, all over the country,
all over the country, yes. And as a part of that process, what we learned is that we want people to consider students who start the year and end the year very highly skilled. And we didn't want those students to be penalized with a lower pathway of progress when it may not be the most appropriate goal for that student to continue to improve their reading fluency, their reading accuracy, and their comprehension skills as represented on DIBELS Next. But for those highly skilled students, we may be focusing on other things that may not be captured in the DIBELS Next scores. And so we set about establishing some may not be represented as well, perhaps would be a better way to say that. They might not show as much movement, and so we didn't want folks to be penalized, and so we have these highly skilled criteria. And so for students at the end of the year that meet these criteria, they will be assigned at least a pathway of 3. Those students could have made enough progress that they might end up getting a higher pathway, but they won't get a pathway lower than 3. And this is presented in greater detail in the DIBELS AD manual, which I will encourage everyone to take a look at in case you'd like to know a little bit more about that. But I want to move on now to talk about how all of the information from pathways gets summarized into the AD report. And so we summarize the information from classrooms into tables that show classroom reading progress percentiles. And those percentiles are aligned with criteria for a classroom reading progress descriptor. And these are described here in the table that you're seeing. I can get my pointer here. So in order to have a classroom reading progress descriptor of well above average, the classroom would need to fall within the 96th to the 99th percentile when we look at the percent of students that are on pathways 3, 4, and 5. In contrast to that, if a classroom is assigned a reading descriptor of well below average, that means they fall within the 1st to 4th percentile relative to the percent of students on pathways 3, 4, and 5, compared to other classrooms at their grade level that participate in DIBELS AD. Okay, so going to the next slide. So that information gets summarized in our classroom reading progress percentile tables. And here's a sample one for grade 2, and this is actually was for data from last year. And so second grade classrooms could be compared looking at this table of data. Every time we have at least 100 classrooms, we can generate one of these tables. This one happens to be based on 281 second grade classrooms. And a classroom that would be described as well below average, meaning that they fell between the 1st and 4th percentile compared to other second grade classrooms, would have had between 0 and 26% of their students having typical progress or better, so not very many students. A classroom that's assigned the average reading progress descriptor would fall between the 25th and 75th percentile compared to other second grade classrooms, and have 44% to 69% of the students making typical progress or better. Okay, I want to show you another example of these tables, because what you'll see changes, because there's a different table for each grade, is what's in this column here that I'm circling with the arrow. That third column is what you'll see change as you go from one grade level to another. Now you'll see that they were small changes, but it did change. This is for 4th grade. And so in 4th grade, to get the average reading classroom progress descriptor and fall between the 25th and 75th percentile, 46 to 67% of your students would need to be falling at the typical progress or better range. Okay, so it's just subtle differences there, but it is different. So how does this get, how do we take that classroom reading progress data and get to here. So let's look back at that report. Here's that same 4th grade report that Roland was speaking about. And in this classroom, 6 of the 8 students, or 75% of the students, were making typical reading progress or better. Okay, so that means they were on pathway 3, 4, or 5. And I've circled over here the stars, and you can see that we just counted up the number of students who had 3 or more stars. And so if we go back to see, well, where does 75% of my students making typical progress or better fall? It's right here in this table. And so this classroom would be receive the descriptor of above average classroom reading progress. And so that is how that is done. And that information then appears on a DIBELS AD report. And I'm going to skip ahead a couple slides because I want to show you actually what will appear either on page 2 or on the lower half of the report page. You will see a report that looks like this. And I'll come back to this here in just a moment. I'm going to go back to what you'll see either at the top of the report or on page 1. You're going to see a narrative and some bulleted points to keep in mind. This goes back to the discussion we were having at the start of the webinar when I was talking about those contextual variables to keep in mind. This is a reminder to consider those things as you consider the DIBELS AD report data. And so this will appear either near the top or on the first page of every DIBELS AD report, just to kind of help us consider what are the teacher-related factors, what are the student-related factors that we want to keep in mind as we digest this information, what are those system-related factors, and are there home and community factors we need to consider as well as we look at our AD reports. So let's go to the report now, and we'll talk a few minutes about that. You will see the columns won't be labeled as A, B, C, D, E like they are here on the slide. That's just for our discussion purposes. But in that first column, labeled column A, you'll see your teachers divided up by classroom grade level. So we have 3 kindergarten teachers here, 3 first grade teachers, 4 second grade teachers, and 4 third grade teachers on this report. We have the total number of students in each of those teachers' classroom listed in column B. In column C, we see the percent of students who were in pathways 3, 4, or 5. That means they were making typical progress or better. And so for Bradley's AM kindergarten, 34.8% of the students in that classroom, or 8 of the 23 students. You see the 8's very small underneath the percent there. 8 of the 23 students, or almost 35%, were making typical progress or better. The next column talks about the classroom reading progress percentile. That goes from those colorful tables I showed you a moment ago. And for this teacher's classroom fell at the 11th percentile, which gets translated to below average classroom reading progress. And so if I were considering this information, I might think about, how do all my kindergarten classrooms look? Do I have one kindergarten classroom that looks very different from the others? Why might that be? Were there issues related to mobility or student-related issues? Were there professional development or resource issues? Were there instructional issues that I need to think about going on in that particular classroom? So those are things that we just want to start the conversation with. We also might look for areas of strength. If you look at first grade and third grade, you'll see that several classrooms were above average classroom reading progress. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 of those classrooms had above average reading progress. We can look for things that we're doing in those classrooms. Are those things that we can carry into other classrooms to build those classrooms up as well? And so not only can you look within a grade level, but you can also look across grade levels to see if there are systematic issues to take into consideration. Okay, and so I just wanted to make sure that we've spent some time looking at this report and digesting it, and I'm sure that folks will have questions about this particular report, but I wanted to point a couple of those things out. The other thing that you might think about is, are there things that are happening in a classroom that we would want to carry forward for those students into the next year's classroom? So I'm pointing to LT Finley's class because this was one of those classrooms that had above average classroom reading progress, and this is a third grade classroom. You might think about, what are we doing for this set of students and in this classroom that we want to carry forward into next year's fourth grade classroom? So these are all things that you might think about and talk about as you digest these reports. The other thing I want to say about these reports is these reports are designed for administrators. We would not be expecting that these data would be shared broadly with teachers. You want to talk about the data and what the results were for an individual teacher, but you wouldn't share other teachers' data with a specific teacher's data with another teacher that's not that teacher. I don't know that I said that very clearly, but you wouldn't take this report and hand it out to everyone at your school. That would be an inappropriate thing to do. So individual teachers' data should be shared only with that individual teacher and not with others. And we feel like, that folks can use this information to identify strengths and needs, both within and across grade levels, by looking at those patterns, some of which I already pointed out on that particular report. We might think about things that are student-related issues. Is there greater transiency or absence rates in a particular classroom compared to others? Are there instructional issues that we need to be attending to? Things like the resources available, the use of effective instructional practices, the amount of teaching experience that someone has at a particular grade level. And those are some of the things that we would want building administrators to reflect upon and consider as they think about professional development, resource needs, resource allocation issues, and the way those things are organized within the school. When we sit down to share these data with teachers, the DIBELS AD data should be shared in a way that's supportive to teachers and their skill development. In addition to the accountability issues, we want these data to serve as a stimulus and a resource for conversations about how to improve outcomes. We want those, again, to be shared in the context of other pieces of information that feed into the evaluation process, including historical information. And again, just a reminder about some of those other considerations to consider. Home and community resources, district-level resources, instructional context, take a look at your school-wide data, the transience of the student population, data across years are all things to be thinking about. Again, a reminder that this is one piece of information with respect to decision making. We want folks to consider it within the system broadly in terms of the information available. And as you're sharing these data with teachers, keep in mind that this may be a very new way to think about accountability. And it's important to reinforce the notion that almost everywhere now, teacher effectiveness is going to be judged in part by student progress, and it might be uncomfortable at first, and it might take a little bit of getting used to, and you should probably expect a variety of reactions from folks as these data are shared. But try to share the notion that the data will be used to guide and inform the support that's provided to that teacher and his or her students. Some other things to keep in mind. We want to make sure that the information is shared as soon as it's available. There are some other resources people might want to take advantage of. There are things listed here related to grouping suggestions and some other assessments that are available. There are things parallel to that within the mCLASS system that you might consider as resources. Make sure that people take advantage of the opportunity to progress monitor students when that's necessary, and to take the time to review the data that you have. And I'm going to turn it back to Roland real quick with some other caveats before we take some questions.
Now these caveats, really, I feel like we have brought these up. We have discussed these. I just want to sort of come back to these caveats at the end. You need to think about all of the data, all the information that we have. It must be administered with fidelity and done in the right way. It must never be practiced. It always should be a cold read. When you're looking at the data, if you see scores for a student or for a teacher that just don't make sense to you, you should always check that, and you can retest with another form of the assessment. I think that's one of the real appeals of DIBELS, is that there are alternate forms where you can double check to make sure that your information is correct. Kelly has referred to the DIBELS for Accountability Decisions Use Manual. This really has a description of our thoughts in more detail. I'd encourage you to access that and check it out. I'd encourage you to talk with us if you have questions. If there's something we can do to improve DIBELS AD and the user experience, we really want to know about that. There is a webinar that is available in the Leadership Web series that you can see, and you may contact us at info@dibels.org at any time. Here's a few references that are relevant to this discussion. And at this point, we'd like to entertain questions from anybody. So please use the chat window to send in a question. And Elisa will be sort of monitoring that and mediating the questions. So Elisa, what questions do we have?
Well, we're going to wait for some, for questions to be submitted. And while those are coming in, I do have one question. If you could go back over, what do you do about a student who doesn't have beginning of year assessment data in DIBELS Next? If a student has moved into the classroom during the school year and we do not have the beginning of year DIBELS Next assessment for them, we're just not able to evaluate their progress. We're not able to include them in the DIBELS AD report or the classroom progress report. So for now, will not be able to be included in the classroom evaluation. In future years, we hope to be able to provide partial information if they move in by the middle of the year, but not for this year. Okay. Something that you all alluded to in the presentation was about the equating of the DIBELS AD forms to DIBELS Next forms. The question is, could you please explain that one more time? What did you mean when you said there would be an equated score, and why does the score need to be equated?
The equating occurs because the DIBELS AD materials are different materials than DIBELS Next. They are different passages. They are different stories. All of the stories were written for DIBELS AD using the same criteria as DIBELS Next. They are, because of the way they are created, very close to being equivalent, and as we have tried them out with students, we find that they're 2 or 3 or 5 points different, easier or harder, that they just may be more engaging, they may be more familiar to students. But there's something that's making like a 2 to 5 point difference. Now, 2 to 5 points in the context of like 120 words correct per minute is not a very big difference. For progress monitoring, I wouldn't even worry about that much of a difference. But for a high-stakes decision, we felt it was very important to equate even that 2 to 5 point difference and make them be even closer. So all of the materials have been, we have been conducting an equating study. All the materials have been used both DIBELS Next and DIBELS AD, we are able to figure out how they should be adjusted to be exactly equivalent.
Great. And then there was another question, and I don't know if we can get to this in a short answer now or if it needs to be followed up with, so I'll let you make that call yourself. The writer says they have looked at DORF in grades 3 and 4, and they want to know, how does the composite score work in grades K and 1 when you have measures that change from beginning to middle or middle to end of the year?
That's a really important question. And across kindergarten and first grade, the skills that are the target and the skills that work best in the composite evolve from the beginning of year to middle of year to end of year. As we have worked on the pathways of progress, we are using the beginning of the year composite to make an estimate of where students should be on the end of the year composite in such a way that because they're based on different measures, it does not compromise the pathways and the way that we're going to be evaluating progress. So this is not just subtracting on the composite. We're actually looking and creating the pathways in a different procedure. I can go into that in more detail, but it would take a longer answer to this.
Thank you. I think that was enough to answer for now, and it is at the top of the hour, and so I think that you have hit on the questions that have come in. There is one question that is specific to the mCLASS community regarding pathways of progress, and for that question and its rollout within the mCLASS system, that question will be answered offline at a later time. And I think at this point we're going to let you all just wrap it up.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Be sure to contact us if you have questions.
Bye-bye.
And we have listed 2 links in the chat box for 1, Dynamic Measurement Group, and 2, for the webinar series that was mentioned if you want to look at an archived webinar on this same topic.